The courthouse was packed that day. Judge Charles Mitchell, a man of routine and precision, settled into his usual rhythm. He had been a judge for over 2 decades, and his reputation for tough but fair decisions was well established in the community. His days followed a predictable pattern: court cases, motions, verdicts, and the occasional plea for leniency. It wasn't that he lacked empathy, but he believed in the structure of the law and its unwavering need for enforcement. That morning, as the clock ticked past 9, Vanessa Rivers' name was called. She stood up from the bench where she had been waiting, her posture straight and confident. She was a woman in her early 30s, her black blazer sharp and her demeanor calm, even in the face of the mundane traffic violation that had brought her before the judge. Her dark hair was neatly pulled back, and her face was one of quiet focus. Yet there was something different about her, something in the way she moved that made her stand out. Judge Mitchell glanced up from his desk, sizing up his next case. His eyes lingered on Vanessa for a moment longer than usual, but he quickly refocused, ready to get through what seemed like just another simple case. He had seen plenty of minor infractions before, people coming and going with excuses, usually trying to avoid the consequences of their actions. "Miss Rivers," Judge Mitchell began, his voice clear and authoritative, "you've been charged with an infraction of failing to comply with local regulations." He paused, glancing down at the paperwork. "I trust this won't take long. What do you have to say for yourself?" Vanessa met his gaze directly. She wasn't intimidated by the formality of the courtroom or the presence of the judge. "Your Honor," she said, her tone steady, "I understand the importance of following the rules. This was a mistake on my part, but it was due to an oversight in my schedule." She explained that her work often required her to juggle multiple responsibilities across different sectors, sometimes leading to miscommunication or delays. Judge Mitchell raised an eyebrow, not particularly moved by her explanation. She didn't seem distraught or nervous, which to him signaled a certain nonchalance. "You should have planned better," he said bluntly. "This court takes these matters seriously. We have rules, and they must be followed." Vanessa nodded, her expression unchanging. She knew the judge was just doing his job. But what the judge didn't know was that Vanessa wasn't just another person caught in a minor mistake. She was the driving force behind a series of major reforms in the country's government systems. And today, this courthouse, a place that had seemed so routine to her, would become a turning point in both of their lives. As Judge Mitchell handed down his decision, issuing a fine, Vanessa quietly accepted it. But beneath her calm exterior, her mind was already elsewhere, on the work she was doing to change the systems that had made this very moment possible. She would leave this courtroom with her head held high, but she would also leave with a spark of determination that something needed to shift, not just in the courts, but across the nation. Vanessa Rivers walked out of the courtroom with a small, crumpled ticket in her hand, the fine that had been imposed by Judge Mitchell for her minor infraction. The weight of the paper seemed to add an unnecessary burden to her already packed schedule. It wasn't that the amount was significant. It was the principle of it. To her, this wasn't just about a fine. It was about being dismissed by a system that often overlooked people with ideas for change, like her. The courtroom had felt cold, the air thick with a kind of bureaucratic indifference. As she stepped out into the hallway, Vanessa allowed herself a moment of frustration. It wasn't the first time she had been misunderstood, but it stung all the same. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, a woman who had been leading nationwide efforts to modernize government services, and yet she had been reduced to another name on the judge's docket. She had spent countless hours redesigning inefficient systems, advocating for reforms that could save taxpayers billions, but it seemed as if she was still just another rule breaker in the eyes of those in positions of power. Despite her initial irritation, Vanessa took a deep breath and calmed herself. There was work to do. She knew that this small setback, this fine, was a trivial moment in the grand scheme of what she was building. A new, more efficient government infrastructure. Her efforts were already in motion across the country, from local courthouses to federal agencies. Her work had the potential to improve lives, streamline services, and save money, but that vision was often too big for most people to see in a single glance. She was determined to continue pushing forward, regardless of the small personal obstacles in her path. The sound of the courthouse door opening behind her snapped her out of her thoughts. She turned to see a familiar face, a reporter who had been following her work for some time. It was Sarah Hayes, an investigative journalist who had taken a keen interest in Vanessa's work with the federal government's efficiency initiatives. Sarah had been working on a piece about government reforms for months, and Vanessa had agreed to speak with her a few times for background information. "Vanessa, you okay?" Sarah asked, sensing the tension in Vanessa's posture. Vanessa smiled faintly, adjusting the fine in her hand. "Just another day in the system," she replied with a shrug. "But I'll be fine. Thanks for asking." Sarah raised an eyebrow, clearly sensing there was more to the story than Vanessa was letting on. She had seen the change in Vanessa over the past few months, a woman whose passion for change was only rivaled by the pressure she felt in navigating a bureaucracy that didn't always understand her vision. "I heard about the fine," Sarah said, her voice lowering slightly. "Want to talk about it?" Vanessa hesitated for a moment, then nodded. She understood the value of the press, perhaps even more than ever now. If Sarah could help tell her story, maybe it would spark something in the wider community. She needed people to understand that her work was not just about rules, it was about transforming the systems that control them. "Sure," Vanessa replied, her voice steady. "Let's talk. But I think it's time people understood something about the work I'm really doing." As Vanessa sat down across from Sarah, she straightened her jacket and took a moment to collect her thoughts. She knew the reporter had a way of digging deeper, and she wasn't going to waste the opportunity. This was more than just about explaining a traffic fine. It was about revealing the larger picture, the work she was quietly spearheading to change the very systems that affected her and millions of others every day. "People don't usually connect my name with government reform," Vanessa began, her tone thoughtful yet firm. "They see me as just another consultant, someone who works behind the scenes to make sure the wheels of bureaucracy turn smoothly. But that's far from the full story." Sarah set her recorder down, sensing that Vanessa was about to unveil something big. "What do you mean?" Vanessa took a deep breath. "I'm not just here to help make things more efficient. I'm here to rethink the entire structure of how government services function. I'm part of a team that's reimagining the way public agencies operate across the country. We're eliminating redundancies, introducing technology to streamline processes, and making sure that taxpayers' money is actually working for them." Sarah's eyes widened slightly as she leaned forward. "So, you're saying your work is part of a nationwide effort to overhaul the entire government system?" Vanessa nodded. "Exactly. Right now, we're piloting a series of projects that integrate new technologies into public services, from applying AI to simplify case management in the courts to creating digital interfaces for citizens to interact with government agencies. It's not about small changes. It's about fundamental shifts that will save time, resources, and make services more accessible to everyone, especially marginalized communities who don't always have the luxury of navigating red tape." Sarah was silent for a moment, processing the gravity of Vanessa's words. "But how does a woman in your position, leading these huge initiatives, end up in a courthouse for a traffic fine?" Vanessa's gaze softened. "Because the system doesn't always see you for what you're doing. It sees what's in front of it, an isolated incident, a minor mistake. It doesn't take into account the bigger picture. And I get it. I can't expect the system to change overnight. But the moment I walked into that courtroom, I felt like I was invisible. The judge didn't know that I've spent years working with local governments, advising them on how to serve people better. To him, I was just another name in a pile of cases." Sarah nodded, understanding now why Vanessa seemed unshaken in court. It wasn't just the fine that didn't matter. It was the much bigger mission that drove her. "You're not just making minor tweaks. You're changing the entire system from the ground up," Sarah said slowly, almost in awe. Vanessa smiled, but there was a quiet determination in her eyes. "That's right. And no matter how many fines I get, or how many small battles I fight, I'm not stopping. If anything, they just fuel my drive to prove that what we're doing can work. I want to show people that a more efficient government can exist. One where services aren't just for the privileged few, but for everyone." Sarah's hand hovered over her notepad, taking in the scope of Vanessa's words. "This isn't just about government. It's about transforming the way we interact with power, isn't it?" Vanessa nodded once more. "Exactly. And it starts with understanding that the system should work for everyone, not just those who have the time or resources to navigate it. If I can change that, then the fine, well, that's just a small part of the bigger journey." The following morning, Sarah Hayes' article went live. It wasn't the kind of story Vanessa had expected, certainly not the kind she'd envisioned when she first agreed to speak with the reporter. What began as a simple feature on government reform quickly evolved into a captivating narrative about Vanessa's life, her work, and her encounter with the court. The headline read, "Behind the Scenes of Government Reform. Meet the woman who's revolutionizing the system, one court fine at a time." The piece was more than just an expose on her professional achievements. It captured the essence of who Vanessa was, a determined, passionate woman who had spent years reshaping public services across the country while quietly fighting the limitations of bureaucracy. It painted a picture of someone who had devoted her career to improving the very systems that had, in an instant, dismissed her. The article included details about her role in launching innovative technology solutions in local governments, cutting waste, and improving access to resources for underserved communities. But what caught the attention of the wider public was the juxtaposition of her high-level accomplishments and the way she was treated in the courthouse, a striking reminder of how even the most important voices in society can be overlooked by systems that prioritize rules over people. As the article gained traction, it quickly went viral. Social media exploded with discussions about Vanessa's work. People from all walks of life began to recognize her name. Some were inspired by her achievements, while others, especially those who had faced similar frustrations with government systems, felt a deep connection to her story. It wasn't just about efficiency or innovation. It was about the personal experience of being silenced or disregarded despite having the power to drive significant change. Vanessa hadn't anticipated this level of attention. The flood of messages, comments, and emails was overwhelming. She had expected the article to be a minor blip, something that would raise awareness in the circles that mattered, but nothing that would rock her world. Instead, it had catapulted her into the public eye in a way she hadn't prepared for. The questions were everywhere. Who is Vanessa Rivers? What is her real impact on government reform? How did someone who seemed so ordinary end up changing the future of public services? By midday, Vanessa's phone rang. It was from an unfamiliar number. She answered, bracing herself for another round of questions or comments about the article. "Vanessa Rivers?" The voice on the other end asked. It was deep and measured, familiar but somehow official. "This is Judge Charles Mitchell. I hope I'm not interrupting." Vanessa blinked, surprised to hear from the man who had fined her just days ago. She had thought little of him since the court hearing, but now she could sense the gravity in his voice. "No, not at all, Judge," she replied, keeping her tone neutral. "How can I help you?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I've been reading about you, Vanessa," Judge Mitchell said. "And after reflecting on that day in court, I think I may have been too quick to judge you. We need to talk." Vanessa's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure what he wanted or where this conversation would go, but one thing was certain. The judge's unexpected interest in her story was the beginning of something far bigger than the fine he had imposed. The phone call with Judge Mitchell was brief, but it left Vanessa with a sense of uneasy curiosity. She hadn't expected him to reach out, especially not so soon after the article had gone viral. Her first instinct was to dismiss it. After all, what did it matter now? But something in his tone suggested that this wasn't going to be just a formality. She decided to give him the benefit of the doubt. The following day, They arranged to meet in person. Vanessa didn't know what to expect, but when she arrived at the small cafe the judge had suggested, she found him seated at a corner table, looking out of place in a business suit that seemed a little too stiff for the casual setting. He looked up as she approached, standing quickly and offering a handshake. There was an awkwardness to the exchange, but the sincerity in his eyes made it clear this wasn't just about an apology for the fine. "Vanessa," Judge Mitchell began, after they had both sat down, his voice low but earnest. "I'm not sure where to start, but I feel like I owe you an apology. The way I treated you in court, well, it wasn't right. I've had time to reflect on it since your article came out, and I've realized I was too quick to judge you." He paused, almost as if searching for the right words. "You're not just another person passing through the system. You're someone trying to change it, and I didn't see that." Vanessa studied him carefully. She'd read about his no-nonsense reputation, how he prided himself on being firm but fair. She had assumed that he was one of those people who would never admit to mistakes, especially not publicly. And yet, here he was, admitting to a misstep. She could see that the judge wasn't just offering a simple apology. He was acknowledging a deeper truth about the way the system often fails to recognize the value of individuals who are working to fix it. She didn't rush to respond. Vanessa wasn't the kind of person who accepted apologies just for the sake of politeness. She needed to understand if this was genuine or just an attempt to save face after being thrust into the spotlight. "I appreciate your honesty, Judge," she said after a moment, her tone measured. "But you have to understand, it's not just about what happened in that courtroom. It's about a system that so often fails to recognize the bigger picture. People like me, who are working to change things, get lost in it. We're reduced to cases, numbers, or stories that fit within the narrow boundaries of right and wrong." She paused, letting her words sink in. "I know you weren't trying to make it personal, but that's exactly the problem. This system doesn't always see what's at stake." The judge nodded thoughtfully, his gaze reflecting a deeper understanding than Vanessa had expected. "You're right. I've spent my career focusing on the details of each case, but I've never really thought about how those details might fit into something larger. I've always believed in the law's ability to deliver justice, but I've never really questioned how it's delivered or who it benefits." Vanessa leaned back, considering his words. This wasn't the kind of apology she'd anticipated. This was more of an awakening. She could feel the weight of the moment, but while she was moved by his reflection, she knew that action spoke louder than words. She wasn't here for sympathy. She was here for change. "Judge," she said, her voice steady, "I'm not asking you to fix everything overnight. But if you truly want to make things right, you'll have to do more than apologize. You'll have to actively engage in the work that's changing the system, because it's going to take more than one person, more than one judge, to truly make a difference." For the first time, Judge Mitchell smiled, and there was something genuine in his expression. "I'm ready to learn. If you'll let me, I want to be part of that change." The conversation with Judge Mitchell lingered in Vanessa's mind for the rest of the day. It was rare for people in positions of power to admit their mistakes, let alone suggest they were willing to learn and change. But something in the judge's demeanor had struck a chord with her. There was sincerity in his voice, a genuine willingness to understand the flaws in the system he had long upheld. Vanessa wasn't one to take such gestures lightly, especially not from someone who had just days earlier treated her like a mere statistic. But she saw potential in what he was proposing. A few days after their meeting, Vanessa received an email from Judge Mitchell, inviting her to a follow-up meeting. The subject line read, "Proposal for Collaboration." Vanessa raised an eyebrow at the boldness of the title, but she was intrigued. The judge's interest wasn't fleeting. He seemed determined to turn their conversation into something tangible. When they met again, this time in the judge's office, he wasted no time getting to the point. "I've been thinking a lot about our conversation, Vanessa," Judge Mitchell began, leaning forward, his hands clasped together on the desk. I've come to realize that the changes you're advocating for go beyond what I could accomplish on my own. But I also know that the local court system, well, it's a perfect place to start. There's so much inefficiency, and if we could even make a dent in that, we'd be doing something important." Vanessa nodded, sensing where this was going. "So you're proposing that we work together to implement some of the ideas I've been working on, streamlining the court processes, reducing delays, using technology to improve access, that kind of thing." "Yes," the judge said, his voice steady. "But I think we can do more than just make the court process more efficient. If we can integrate some of the principles you're using in your nationwide projects, things like making services more accessible, lessening the burden on people, and creating systems that are actually fair, I think we can make a significant impact here. And if we succeed, we can set a model for other courts around the country." Vanessa sat back, considering his words carefully. She had spent years pushing for reform on a much larger scale, but working with a local judge to improve a single courthouse felt like a strategic, if small, start. It wasn't exactly the national stage she had envisioned, but it had potential. A successful project in one courthouse could be the proof of concept needed to take her work further. "I'll admit, I wasn't sure what to make of your offer at first," Vanessa said, looking him in the eye. "But I think you're right. This could be a valuable test case. If we can make improvements here, we'll have a solid foundation to present to larger government bodies. But we need to be committed. This can't just be a one-time project. If we're doing this, we're doing it to set a precedent." Judge Mitchell nodded, his expression resolute. "I understand, and I'm committed. I want to be part of this change, not just as a judge, but as someone who can help lead it." Vanessa leaned forward, a spark of hope igniting in her chest. "All right then, let's get started." The next few months were a whirlwind of activity. What had started as an unexpected apology turned into a full-fledged collaboration between Vanessa Rivers and Judge Charles Mitchell. They dove into the details of the local court system, reviewing everything from case management to the public access channels. Vanessa brought in a team of experts, engineers, data analysts, and legal consultants who worked closely with Judge Mitchell and his court staff to identify inefficiencies and potential areas for improvement. At first, the court personnel were skeptical. Many had been working in the same system for years, some even decades, and were resistant to the idea of change. Courtrooms, after all, were places governed by tradition, where precedent often outweighed progress. Judge Mitchell knew this better than anyone, but he also understood that the resistance wouldn't be overcome if they didn't show clear, tangible results. Vanessa, with her strategic mind and deep understanding of bureaucratic reform, knew that getting buy-in was crucial. The first step was to implement a pilot project, a new digital case management system that streamlined everything from filing to scheduling. Instead of endless paperwork, everything would be logged and processed electronically, reducing backlogs and the potential for human error. Vanessa's team worked day and night to customize a software platform that could handle the unique needs of the court system while being user-friendly for both staff and citizens. But the digital overhaul was just the beginning. They also introduced a more citizen-friendly approach to court procedures. Using data analytics, Vanessa's team identified the most common pain points for people navigating the system: long wait times, unclear instructions, and a lack of transparency about what was happening with their cases. To address this, they implemented an online portal where people could check the status of their cases, access relevant legal documents, and even communicate with court staff. This new digital transparency made the process less daunting for those unfamiliar with the legal system and provided a clearer picture of what was happening behind the scenes. Judge Mitchell was instrumental in pushing these changes through. His deep respect for tradition and the rule of law didn't prevent him from embracing innovation. Instead of resisting the changes, he actively championed them, speaking to his colleagues about the benefits of the new systems and encouraging them to embrace the future. Vanessa was impressed by how quickly the judge had adapted. His willingness to get on board and his genuine interest in the reforms made the transition smoother than she'd expected. But it wasn't without its challenges. There were still hiccups, technical issues with the new software, resistance from some court staff who felt overwhelmed by the changes, and the inevitable growing pains that came with overhauling a long-standing system. But every time they overcame one of these obstacles, the improvements became more evident. The backlogs were shrinking, court dates were getting scheduled faster, and the citizens using the system were giving positive feedback. It didn't take long before word of their success spread. Other local courts, initially skeptical of the changes, began reaching out to Vanessa and Judge Mitchell to learn how they could implement similar systems. The small pilot program was starting to show that their approach could be replicated, and the impact was already beginning to ripple outward. Despite the successes, Vanessa knew they were just getting started. Their work together had proven the potential of their partnership, but the real test would be whether they could take this model to a national level. If this local courthouse could transform, surely other government systems could follow suit. But one thing was clear: this was just the beginning of something much larger. Months passed, and the local courthouse was practically unrecognizable from the place it had been when Vanessa and Judge Mitchell first started working together. The digital case management system was running smoothly, cases were being processed faster, and public satisfaction had surged. The courtroom, once filled with frustrated citizens and overwhelmed staff, now operated with a newfound efficiency and transparency. The changes had ripple effects that went beyond just the courthouse walls, touching the lives of everyone who interacted with the system. Judge Mitchell, who had once been known for his strict, traditional approach, was now a vocal advocate for the reforms. His colleagues, who had initially resisted the changes, began to see the results firsthand. Courtrooms were less cluttered, cases were moving more quickly, and citizens were far less likely to experience the frustrating delays that had once been the norm. The judge started to receive recognition not just within the local legal community, but also from policymakers who saw the potential for broader application. Vanessa's work had, in a sense, done what she had always hoped it would. It had proven that a better, more efficient government was not just a pipe dream. It was achievable. It wasn't just about cutting costs or improving workflows. It was about serving the public more effectively and humanely. The success of this partnership was becoming the proof of concept she needed to expand her efforts beyond just one courthouse. However, Vanessa knew that if they were going to truly transform the system, they couldn't stop here. Other jurisdictions were watching what they had accomplished, and she had no intention of letting the momentum slip away. There was still a lot of work to do. She began working on a proposal to scale the reforms, to take the lessons learned in the local courthouse and apply them to court systems around the country. It was a massive undertaking, one that would require buy-in from political leaders, government agencies, and most importantly, the people who were still skeptical about change. Judge Mitchell, now fully on board with the vision, became a powerful ally. He leveraged his connections within the judicial system and local government to advocate for the expansion of their model. He spoke at conferences, met with lawmakers, and used his newfound platform to champion the idea of a modernized, accessible government system. With his influence and Vanessa's expertise, they built a coalition of supporters, including legal reform advocates, tech entrepreneurs, and community leaders. As the movement gained momentum, Vanessa started receiving invitations to speak at national conferences and policy forums. Her story of how an unexpected find had led to a partnership that changed the course of her work captured the imagination of those who had been searching for real solutions to long-standing issues in government. It was clear that they weren't just pushing for efficiency anymore. They were redefining what public service could look like in the 21st century. What began with a fine in a small courtroom had snowballed into a movement that was changing the way people thought about government, one that could be more efficient, more accountable, and, ultimately, more human. Vanessa had proven that even in a system built on tradition and bureaucracy, there was always room for innovation. And now, Her vision was poised to reshape the future of government for generations to come.